Hi, it's me, Ingrid INFP, and I wanted to do a book review of The Song of the Cell by Siddhartha Mukherjee, and it's an exploration of medicine and the new human. He's written other books, but I haven't read them, so this is the first one. It just happened to be at the library, like in the new section. This book was written in 2022, so it was after COVID or during COVID, you could say. There are a lot of bookmarks here, so let's get into it. I really like this book. It was really interesting as a doctor. It talks a little bit about the history of medicine, and his introduction is particularly good. I haven't read the whole book. I have 90 pages left, but I've read almost 300 pages, so I think that's is good enough to go on. Maybe I'll add something at the end once I've read the whole book. Anyway, he always starts his chapters with a quote, and he has a lot of Rudolf Virchow, 1858. No matter how we twist and turn, we shall eventually come back to the cell. So the cell is very important when it comes to medicine. So the way that the reason why it's called the Song of the Cell is because he says like this: a gene without the cell is lifeless. An instruction manual stored inside an inert molecule, a musical score without a musician, a lonely library with no one to read the books within it. A cell brings materiality and physicality to a set of genes. A cell enlivens genes. I just love how he discusses things. That's why there are so many quotes. And he talks about how a lot of cell biology, the history of cell biology, is connected to the development of scopes and of glass. He says, if cloudless Italy was a land made for telescopes, then foggy dark England seems custom made for microscopes. So that was funny. He talks a lot about the history of how we found cells. He says so he talks about a scientist, and she embodied our desire to get to the luminous heart of the cell, to understand its endlessly captivating mysteries. And she embodied our aching aspiration to witness the birth of a new kind of medicine, cellular therapies, based on our deciphering the physiology of cells. He talks a lot about different scientists in this book, and he's met quite some high people in the field, in the research field. And then he says the book is itself a sum of parts: history and personal history, physiology and pathology, past and future, and an intimate chronicle of my own growth as a cell biologist and doctor, spun together into a whole. The organization is cellular, if you will. Okay, sorry about the cars. So there are different parts, and so here we get into part 1, discovery. And he says the word fabric, this was the human body. This is how people used to think of medicine. There was a book published called De Humana Corporis Fabrica, the fabric of the human body. The word fabric in the title was a clue to its texture and purpose. This was the human body treated like physical material, not mystery, made of fabric, not spirit. It was part medical textbook and part scientific treatise. He talks a lot about how at first surgery was more of butcher's work, barber's work, than actually doctor's work. And so figuring out about physiology through cells actually brought the world of medicine way forward in the field of science. So he said that Vesalius had put human anatomy at the center of medicine. And so the first step was figuring out anatomy. And then the next step was figuring out that these organs that we could describe had a function more than just like the spiritual function, you know. He talks about how difficult life was for medical students, and how they lived. They ate a daily ration of meat, potatoes, and watery soup, and lived in small, isolated, self-contained chambers, cells. So I like how he can make anything into a cell, basically. Then Virchow says, true knowledge is to be aware of one's ignorance. How much and how painfully do I feel the gaps in my knowledge? It is for this reason I do not stand still in any branch of science. There's much that is uncertain and irresolute about me. And then somehow he compares that to like a red blood cell, because the red blood cells are the wandering cells of the body that go through the blood. And also he does refer back to this when he gets to the chapter about COVID. So, because, well, we thought that we knew everything, but we really didn't. Then, so the first chapter here is called The Visible Cell. And fictitious stories about the little animals, the animalculus, because that's what people saw in the microscope. No greater pleasure has yet come to my eye than the spectacle of the thousands of living creatures in a drop of water. And that's Leeuwenhoek. Sorry for my Dutch. But he called them animalcules. And these are like little creatures in a droplet of water. So those were the first cells that people saw through a microscope. But these were unicellular beings. And so it says that the pioneer of optics, Robert Hooke, the man who brought whole universes into view, is invisible to us. No definitive likeness or portrait of Hooke exists today. That's sad, but okay. But Hooke was a big person in the microscope and learning about things through microscope. So then he talks about blood, the universal cell. You have to move from a continuous organization of the biological world to a description that involves discontinuous, discrete, autonomous elements that unify that world. So cells are all separate things that create the larger whole, rather than just like everything is just part of everything. There were people who thought that, like the vitalists, who thought that everything was built out of the same thing. But it's not that way. They are cells with different functions. Metaphorically, you might say that you have seen past flesh, continuous, corporeal, and visible, to imagine blood, invisible, corpuscular, and discontinuous. And then he goes further to say that the cell is a laboratory of reactions that enables life. The cell, as it were, is experimenting with physiology, passing molecules in and out, making chemicals and destroying chemicals. Then he goes to talk about what the vitalists thought. They thought that there must be some divine mark that distinguishes the fluids and bodies of living things, vitalists proposed. The wind in the harp. So like we're animated by some kind of divine force rather than like some physiological process. So there was a lot of fighting between different people. Then it talks about how the body is a cell state in which every cell is a citizen, Virchow would write. Diseases is merely the conflict of the citizens of the state brought about by the action of external forces. So he talks a little bit about the citizen cell as like the state is the body and the cell is the citizen. And Virchow went further to talk about like how all cells come from other cells, omnis cellula e cellula. And then he talks about more pillars that he found. Then he says, every disease depends on an alteration of a larger or smaller number of cellular units in the living body. Every pathological disturbance, every therapeutic effect finds its ultimate explanation only when it's possible to designate the specific living cellular elements involved. Which that was pretty amazing at the time, because that's not at all how, people thought of it beforehand. Then he talks about how we figured out that, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Prokaryotes are before the nucleus, and eukaryotes have a nucleus in their cell. And he said, compared with bacteria, we are fragile, feeble, finicky beings capable of inhabiting vastly more limited environments and restricted ecological niches. Because, we lack a lot of things that make bacteria resistant to everything. Then he talks about Claude Bernard. I know Claude Bernard as like the guy who, I think he was the one who figured out insulin in dogs, diabetes, and he did something with dogs, I forget. But he says, la fixité du milieu intérieur est la condition de la vie libre, indépendance. The constancy of the interior environment is the condition of free and independent life, which Claude Bernard wrote in 1878. So the shifting of physiology from action to the maintenance of fixity. So a point of physiological activity, paradoxically, was to enable stasis. So it's basically a little bit counterintuitive that a large part of cellular biology is how the cell maintains homeostasis, rather than like just what they do. A lot of it is. Then he talks about the tampered cell, like the affected cell, not the healthy cell. And then he talks also about IVF and different things. So he talks about the genetic manipulation of the human embryo. At the center of this therapy lies an incredibly malleable and increasingly precious cell, the fertilized egg cell, the human zygote. And he talks about how did we become multicellular organisms? How did several cells decide to bond together to become an organism? And then it talks more about the developing cell, the sperm and the ovarial cell, the egg. He talks, the master maker of the embryo is trapped inside a bony prison of the very creature it has created. And that's the cell of the notochord. The notochord, if you're unfamiliar with cellular embryology, it's basically the genetic master of the structure and the creation of the embryo. And all the cells develop around it, because the notochord sends signals out to the rest of the body that is forming. And the notochord, in the end, is basically inside our vertebra. Those cells, they once were masters and now they're like nothing. So that sucks for them. But yeah, he talks a little bit about egg cells as well. Eggs from frogs and that kind of thing. Then he talks a little bit about the development, how that was a new concept as well. We used to think about the fundamental features of our cells as our destiny, manifest. We are now beginning to treat these properties as legitimate arenas of scientific annexation, manifest destiny. So it talks a lot about how, how much are we playing God and all that. These debates, the manipulation of reproduction and development, or embryos to change their genes, are ricocheted around the globe as I write this. So he does talk about Never Let Me Go, which was a book that came out before this book. Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro, and how, basically the plot twist is that all these kids are being harvested for their organs. But actually Kazuo Ishiguro came out with a newer book called Clara and the Sun. And Clara and the Sun, they're basically kids are genetically enhanced. And they also get robots. But there is the genetic enhancement. And only like the privileged kids get enhanced and some don't. I forget the word that they use instead of enhanced. But they get their genes fixed somehow. And these kids would go to these academies to get enhanced. And that is the difficulty with this whole genetic manipulation stuff. And we're at the bare beginnings of it, but it might be one thing to not like to delete certain genes for like really terrible diseases, but it's another thing to, maybe you just want your kid to be intelligent, and so you'll just like cut off the certain genes and add certain genes that make you more intelligent or that kind of thing. And at a certain point, like, are we playing God? Are we, should we allow ourselves to do this? That's a very big question. Then he talks about the restless cell, which is the blood cell, the erythrocyte. And he talks about how each droplet of blood, he's a hematologist and an oncologist, I think, the writer. He really likes looking at the microscope, right? A droplet of blood has been spread upon a glass slide to make a film of single cells, each stained with special dyes. The slides are like previews of books or movie trailers. The cell will begin to reveal the stories of the patients before I even see them in person. Then he kind of talks to himself and he's like, divide the main cellular components of blood, red cell, white cell, platelet. Examine each cell type separately. Write what you observe about each type. Move methodically, number, color, morphology, shape, size. And he likes doing that. So he says, I love looking at cells in the way that the gardener loves looking at plants. Not just the whole, but also the parts within the parts. The leaves, the fronds, the special smell of loam around the fern, the way the woodpecker has bored into the high branches of a tree. Blood speaks to me, but only if I pay attention. But then he talks about how blood speaks to everyone and everything. It is a central mechanism of long-distance communication, of transmission in humans. Be it hormones, nutrients, oxygen, or waste products, blood delivers and connects, talks to every organ from one organ to the next. It even speaks to itself, because the systems signal to each other. Platelets bind together to form a clot. And like blood is a network. And so I find that really inspiring. He talks, cells were so abundant that they must have a function. But the mystery of what red blood cells carried, why the circles circulated so relentlessly, why they squeezed their way so purposely through tiny capillaries, disturbing their very shape, remained unsolved. So this is what Hewson thought. He was like, you know. And then, so circulation depends on the heart, whose essential function depends on, well, circulation, the transmission of every substance in the body, and by extension, the operation of every organ, then, depends on the most restless of our cells. I just like how poetic he is when he talks about this. So he talks about the situation where somebody was like dying, basically, did not have enough blood, and how a blood transfusion helped save this guy's life. Pulse, 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 I said to myself. The man's blood pressure, meanwhile, kept dipping, and his pulse came thready. The code team continued working in a choreographed dance that reminded me of the early days of blood transfusion. Because at first, blood transfusion could only be done, like, we didn't have refrigeration when, like, they were trying to figure out blood transfusions. So it was, like, basically directly from one patient in one bed to the one next to him. This too was a relay race with blood as a central baton. And so he managed to revive this person. That was great. He said, "It was a Macbethian moment. I could not wash off the stains. I threw the clogs in the trash and brought new ones to the hospital store the next morning. Ever since that evening, I never used the word bloodbath casually. I happen to be among the few people that has actually bathed in blood." So yeah, that was a bit dramatic, but that's kind of how it is sometimes when you're a surgeon. I have seen a lot of blood, but probably not as much as this guy. Especially orthopedic surgery, oof, yeah. Then he talks about the guardian cells, so the white blood cells. In short, we carry reverse images of some microbes, or memories of what they incite in our bodies, like photographic negatives on the surface of our cells. Us and them. They are within us, even when they are not within us. It is a symbol of our Kampf. I mean, our fight, you know. Because I think that there were some Germans who were working with this. He talks about how the white blood cells are professional killers, but he talks about the different kinds. Then he talks about how in the 1700s, traditional healers in Sudan were known to practice tishteri el-jidri, buying the pox. The healer, typically a woman, would approach a sick child's mother to purchase the ripest pustules for inoculation, haggling over the price. It was exquisitely measured art. The most astute healers recognized the lesions that were exactly right in their maturity to yield just enough viral material to confer protection, but not so much as to introduce the disease. And this was what they would call variolation, which was the predecessor of vaccines. So he talks about, well, you know, cowpox and the pox and you know, all sorts of diseases. He does talk about Indian mythology a lot because he grew up in India. He said, when he was thinking about this treatment, experimental therapy for a young woman with cancer of the T cells. So she got an infusion with you know, a treatment. And he was thinking, what is she thinking about? Then he fell asleep that night at 4 a.m. I dreamed of my childhood. In my dream, I was a 10-year-old boy in Delhi, thinking about, what else? Droplets. Those drops of blood, right? The monsoon would hit the city in July and August, and I would play a game. As the rains began, I would install myself by the window, open my mouth, and try to catch drops of water. In my dream last night, I cast the droplets in my mouth at first, but a sudden splash of water landed on my eye. And then he started talking about how, he said, I have no claim to genius. I can only feel the perspiration. I cannot get the image of my woman in a trial out of my mind. The only moment I have felt anything similar was during the first few minutes after the birth of my 2 children. But this too was a moment of birth. Perhaps a new therapy is being born, and with it, a new human. So yeah, she got these like super duper white blood cells as a kind of transfusion. So this was like a new treatment. Then he talks about another, basically Indian mythology. He talks about the goddess Shitala and the goddess Manasa. Manasa is the goddess of snakes and the protectress against venoms and snake bites. She is usually depicted as a stately, if steely, being, often standing on a cobra and haloed by a canopy of cobras rearing their heads. Snakes descend from her coils of matted Medusa-like hair. In tribal Bengal, she also wears a snake's body and is often encircled entirely by snakes. The conjoining of the 2 ancient pestilences, I think that Shitala was the pox or something, and Manasa, or was malaria? I forget. And Manasa is the snake. The conjoining of the 2 ancient pestilences carries an old memory. Snake bites and smallpox haunted 17th century India like twin demons, and goddesses to protect each might well share a shrine. So it is only fitting then that the story of the innate immune system begins with Shitala, which is the smallpox, and the story of the second wing of the adaptive immune system, the one composed of antibodies, B cells, and T cells, might begin with a snake bite. So he goes on to talk about the defending cell, the B cells, the T cells. Basically, they tried, George Kohler tried to fuse a virus. He tried to fuse a B cell with a cancer cell. I'm still awestruck by the idea. How do you even think of using the undead to resuscitate the dying? And so they are trying to find treatments for cancer by, sometimes they want to make cancer cells more visible so that the immune system can attack them. Sometimes we try to create cells that can attack cancer cells. Sometimes we want to stop autoimmunity, so we want to hide our own blood cells, our own cells from our immunity cells. It's very complicated. Immunology is a lot. Anyway, then he talks about the subtle intelligence of the T cell. He talks about the thymus, which is where the T cells reach maturation. He talks about how it was a dwindling, dispensable, involuting organ. How could it possibly be essential to human lives? So they thought that it was a vestigial detritus left behind by evolution, much like the appendix. But it wasn't. It was actually an important part of the body. Then he talks about this Italian researcher, Vincenzo Cirundulo, which he calls Enzo. And unfortunately, Enzo dies of cancer. And so it's relevant to the topic of the book. To understand T-cell virology, learn to think like a virus, Enzo told me. And so I did. I would become EBV one afternoon and herpes the next. So he would embody this so deeply. In 2020, I found out that Enzo had died. I canceled my trip. That evening, I sat at the lab silently, recalling my mentor, my Bolognese instructor, my friend, holding back the memories until they had hardened. I felt dazed, desiccated, congealed in gloom, because he's sitting in his lab with all of these cells that are congealing. So yeah. Then he talks about the T cell and how the T cell can recognize things. Our immune system is built on both the recognition of itself and of its distortion. It is designed by evolution to detect the altered self. As Elaine concluded in the seminal article, T cell recognition cannot be explored in a rational way. So they talk about the histocompatibility complex, the MHC, MHC1, MHC2. These are outside of the scope of, I learned all this in medical school. I've forgotten a bit, but these are good reminders. Then he talks again about microscopes. The article is called A Man, a Microscope, a Cell, and So Much More. It is the story of virtually every researcher who inhabits this book is captured in 3 words: a scientist, a scope, a cell. Because that's how most of it is. He talks also about a person who had some weird disease and had like no risk factors for the disease. Like he got toxoplasmosis and he didn't even have a cat, and he caught AIDS, but he didn't even have unprotected sex. There was a lot of weird stuff about this. And so he just says, the black box of causes still remains perfectly sealed. Sometimes human mysteries are deeper than medical ones. Because he didn't... This was at the beginning of AIDS, when still homophobia was rampant. And I guess that, there maybe was some shame in that. Maybe he didn't disclose entirely to his doctor. We'll never be sure. And then it talks a little bit about how cells are so adamant to form organisms that are entirely separate, and how we cannot do transplantations of organs between each other except if we have compatibility. And so that's how we need to have markers of self that distinguishes us from the non-self. And he says, he talks about how in Indian mythology, a lot of it is about how everything is universal, everything is one. But that's not how cells are. He says cellular cells don't particularly like to mix with other cellular cells. Why else would a sponge go to such lengths to limit its fusion with another sponge, to form a blissfully boundless cosmic Brahman sponge? So yeah, that doesn't happen because we are, cells have their own markers. And here he has some pictures of some scientists. And, people old and new. Someone getting a blood transfusion. Then we get to the end of the blood section. He says, blood, a cosmos of cells. The restless ones, red blood cells. The guardians, multilobed neutrophils that mount the first phases of immune response. The healers, tiny platelets, once dismissed as fragmentary nonsense, that define how we respond to breaches in the body. The defenders, the discerners, B cells that make antibody missiles, T cells, door-to-door wanderers that can detect even the whiff of an invader, including possibly cancer. Then he talks again about how we talk about the cellular civilization. It has armies, highways with the blood vessels, it has citadels and walls that are being surveilled by the neutrophils and the platelets. There are identification cards to recognize the citizens and eject intruders with T cells, an army to guard itself with B cells. It has evolved language, organization, memory, architecture, subcultures, and self-recognition. A new metaphor comes to mind, perhaps we might think of it as cellular civilization. Then we get to the pandemic. And this brought back some trauma to me, okay? And so if you're not really going to, the next few minutes might be me just talking a little bit about this. But he talked about, in India it was particularly bad with the Delta wave of the virus. I cannot shake the images or the sounds of the pandemic. Who can? The orange body bags piled in bunks in makeshift morgues, the mass graves in Ecuador, the constant wailing of ambulance sirens outside my hospital. Fusing together until I could hear was a wall of shrieks. The emergency room in the spring of 2021 packed to its brim, with stretchers spilling into the corridors, with patients gasping as they drowned in their own fluids. The ICU scrambling with more beds every day. The exhausted doctors and nurses every evening as they zombied their way across the crosswalk outside my office with that hollow-eyed, post-shift look and the characteristic marks on their faces with the edges of the N95 masks had cut into their cheeks. The withdrawn, empty cities with brown paper bags blowing on the streets. The looks of suspicion or frank terror when a man on the subway coughed or sneezed. And then he talked about how Delhi closed down, leaving millions of migrant workers stranded. My mother was a lone prisoner in her flat in the city. Over the weeks and weeks of confinement, her daily texts were shortened into Morse code of reassurance. In citation, today, okay, end citation. So, this was a little bit how my mom was acting as well. When she was in confinement, she was just like, today was fine. We lived another day, Then he talks about how we don't know anything about anything when it comes to COVID, like what are the long-term consequences of the infection? Why is it more in men than women? Why this, why that? Where does it cause blood clots, blah, blah, blah. The monotony of answers is humbling, maddening. We don't know. We don't know. We don't know. We don't even know what we don't know. COVID exposed the humility that is required to cohabitate with these characters surrounding us. We are like Dickens, except encircled by shadows, ghosts, and liars. Triumphalism fails in the face of more than 6 million deaths. The pandemic energized immunology, but it also exposed gaping fissures of our understanding. It provided the necessary dose of humility. I cannot think of a scientific moment that has revealed such deep and fundamental shortcomings in our knowledge of the biology of a system that we had thought we knew. We have learned so much. We have so much left to learn. And then finally, I came to this section, which is about organs. He talks about how the citizenship of cells. Cellular specialization and citizenship, the hallmarks of the cell biology of an organ, result in properties that can only emerge when multiple cells coordinate their functions and work together. A heartbeat, a thought, and the restoration of constancy, the orchestration of homeostasis. To understand the biology of humans, then, we need to understand organs. And to understand organs, their dysfunctions and disease, and the possibility of rebuilding them, we must understand the biology of the cells that make them work. Then he talks about how the heart is kind of like the seat of belonging, both metaphorically and physically. So he talks about that after COVID, he wanted to write about constancy. He wanted to write about... I wanted to think about... the constant metaphors of battle had become denigrating. I wanted to think about normalcy and about restoration, about cellular systems that form the infrastructure of human physiology, and conversely of the future repair and restoration of the human systems that had failed. I wanted to write about homeostasis and self-correction. I was exhausted by my mulling about how the body recognizes things, viruses that do not belong. I wanted to turn to citizenship, to belonging. And it says, the heart of all organs of the body epitomizes belonging. We use the term belong to signify attachment or love. When we say my heart belongs to you, you signify the link between that organ and that attachment. He talks about his family a little bit. So he went back to Delhi and he said, I could tell you about the neural cascade I experienced, the memories flooding back, the release of epinephrine in my blood. But while the stimulus was triggered in my brain, the experience was felt in my heart. So it was coming back, belonging. And the heartbeat, this phenomenon that many of us might consider the epitome of everyday, the heart would beat more than 2 billion times over an average person's life, is in fact a miraculously complex feat of cell biology. The heart is the model of cellular cooperation, citizenship, and belonging. You know, all the cells have to beat at the same time. The result is miraculous coordination, atrial contraction, ventricular contraction. The heart cells form an orchestrated citizenship. Each cell of the heart muscle maintains its identity, but each cell is so intimately connected to the next that when the impulse of contract arrives, the contraction is purposeful and coordinated. The heart doesn't wobble. Its ventricles contract in one potent push. We might imagine the organ as if it behaves almost like a single-minded cell. Then he talks about the neuron, the contemplating cell. And then he adds a poem from Emily Dickinson. The brain is wider than the sky. 4. Put them side by side. The one the other will contain with ease, and you beside. The brain is deeper than the sea. 4. Hold them, blue to blue. The one the other will absorb, as sponges buckets do. He talks about what it contains, and how he held a brain once. Imagine it as a repository of memory, of consciousness, of speech, temperament, sensation, and feeling, love, envy, hatred, compassion. All of these reposed in the tangle of neurons. I was holding him, I thought, this man whose name or identity I would never know. Somewhere within that organ lived the neurons that had once remembered his mother's face. Somewhere was the memory of his last moment before the car hurtled off the road. Somewhere were the memory of his favorite song. And then he talks about how Kayal draws. He drew quite a lot. It was Kayal's irresistible mania, drawing truths, drawing out truths, laid the foundation for neuroscience. Then I missed a little bit here. I did read the epilogue where he talks about the different. If you've seen my video about 13 ways of looking at the blackbird, he talks about that. I do not know which to prefer, the beauty of inflections or the beauty of innuendos, the blackbird whistling, or just after, for the songs of the cell. And then the epilogue, better versions of me. And he talks about never let me go, and what are we doing when we're doing medicine, transplanting, the levels of transplantation, we're going to become superhuman, human enhancement. At what point are we, to what points are we going? He talks about sickle cell anemia. And he talks about re-engineered cells, and we will be a new sum of new parts if we transplant cells, you know. I got a blood transfusion once, and it really saved my life, and it was like being a new human, even though it was only temporary. Blood cells only live 120 days. But I was receiving somebody else's cells. It's completely crazy, you know. And, you know, all sorts of treatments are using the biology of cells. So, even though I haven't finished reading this book, I would highly recommend this book, especially if you're into biology, cell biology, especially any medical people around you. I think that he explains pretty well. So even if you're not particularly interested in biology, he does explain everything from the start, so you don't need to know. I do think, though, that you need to have some kind of interest in the topic, because it is a pretty thick book. Anyway, have a great day, everybody. Bye.